Starting. Okay, recording started.
And we're transcribing as well. Super. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a slightly delayed community call. Ever since we last spoke, we went to KubeCon and we promised that we'd set up a call soon after that. We've actually been fairly busy and we'll look forward to sharing some of the updates since then with you. So just quickly looking at the agenda for today, we'll be focusing on releases to start with, then moving to slightly wider project updates. In particular, then talking about the overlap with the community and ecosystem side of things. The format last time worked quite well, where we compressed all of our updates to 30 minutes and then left 30 minutes for just general discussion, Q&A. We're looking to do the same today. So we're going to move fairly speedily through things. So if you feel like we're moving too quickly through things, just shout and we can discuss during the Q&A, because we're deliberately trying to leave that time at the end for people for it to be a bit more of an interactive session. So with that, actually, this is the release update section, so I'll hand over to Marcel.
Yes, hello. Can you all hear me? Yes.
Indeed.
Great. Yeah, so these are the upcoming releases that we're currently working on. So that means that for all of these releases, there's at least or really a couple of CLs that are currently being worked on. 0.6, of course, is the closest to completion. It includes the big required fields update, which is fully implemented, except for like a few little like shavings here and there based on feedback and little usability things. But the core algorithm has been working now for a while and is stable in that regard. So we expect this to be, to release this at least before the next community call, let's say. So then maybe not with the first alpha release of 0.6, but soon thereafter, we'll already plan to include some experimental module implementation, even though the proposal is not accepted yet, and we're still working on it. There's still some things to work out, as Roger will discuss later. We'll have some implementations that people can at least play around with, which then will also inform the modules. So Aram will also tell you a little bit more about the WASM, that code that we have for the C API that will come in. So 0.7, so that's also quite far along actually at this moment. It's a lot more work to be done. But basically, it's quite a large re-implementation of the evaluator. So there's 4 main files that are being re-implemented. So the closeness algorithm is greatly simplified. It fixes some bugs, but more importantly, it's the previous one was kind of abstract. The new one is very close to how people tend to think about closeness. So it's much easier to reason about and has some positive effects on the API. So evaluator improvements, there are some changes in the state model, which are much closer to reality and help us have a more recursive first evaluator, which is much more stable and avoids a lot of problems. So most of that is now implemented, and what we're doing is we're having both implementations in the code simultaneously. Most of this is not checked in yet, by the way, but it's a very long CL chain that's sitting in a Garrett client. So basically, both implementations exist simultaneously, and then we use the test suite. So individually, each test is sort of moved to the new evaluator, and making sure that we are not regressing while porting to the new evaluator. So the main thing that's still to be done there and being worked out is just junctions. But there's now a very good understanding of why disjunctions are so incredibly slow in the current evaluator, and what we need to do about it. It just needs to be done, basically. So 0.8, so it's a little bit more in the future. This is really more like closing into V1, right? So there's certain semantic changes we want to make to get us closer to V1, some cleanup, and we really don't want to do that in any of these 0.6 or 0.7, because we'll be changing too much at the same time. So that's why this is all sort of done simultaneously. Next slide. Yeah, in order to sort of plan what goes in what release, we're having a large issue gardening effort. And basically what we're trying to do is to have every issue assigned to some milestone at least, to sort of figure out, okay, where do we expect it to come? So wait a minute.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Marcel, on that point, is that if people are seeing a bit of churn with the Z Garden label on issues, apologies for that. That's just our way of marking progress so that we know we've gotten to all the issues. And on that point of all issues should ultimately have a milestone, is we're not there yet. If you feel we have milestoned an issue incorrectly, i.e. think it's higher priority, please shout. The whole idea behind issues explicitly having a milestone is that they're a means of communication. So that if somebody sees the milestone and says, hang on, that's not high enough priority, because that's generally going to be the way, please shout, and we can just look at trying boosting the milestone of some of these.
Yeah, and so basically we have a lot of issues also marked as feature requests that we are postponing a bit more. So I think especially the newer issues, or with the older issues, we sort of knew where they were landing with, especially, but they still have the garden label. But on the newer issues, most of that is done. Yeah, regarding the milestones, so I've already said like which the milestones correspond to the releases for one, so the required fields, the performance and disjunction fixes, and semantic adjustments. So there's a whole bunch of issues that are marked as needs planning, where we don't really know in which release it will come yet. And then we have what we're calling feature milestones. So there are certain sort of subparts of Q that have so many issues at this time that it makes sense to do it all in one go in one release. We just don't know which release. So these feature milestones will let's say 0.9 or maybe 0.8 already. We decide, okay, let's do trim. Then all the trim milestone issues will move to that release, basically. But it's also a nice way of grouping them.
Just to reiterate, Marcel, you mentioned it earlier on, that for 0.6, the feedback for the required fields so far has been very positive. There's been nobody saying, hang on, this is fundamentally broken. So it looks like 0.6 is going to tentatively land around the time of the next community call. So
yep,
roughly in around a month's time, just to give people some idea of timeline on that side of things.
Yep, and that's it.
So just in finishing the next steps on finishing the issue gardening, that was perhaps implicit in the fact that there are still a number of issues, older ones, because we went reverse chronologically, that have the Z Garden label. That means we just didn't need to do a pass over it. In some situations, we're just going to re-triage to make sure an issue still is an issue. The goal is to milestone all the issues ultimately, and then separately, as Marcel said, do that sweep through feature requests. And then finally, to ensure that all umbrella issues, and we're assigning umbrella issues to the major project areas, are current, and we start to update them a bit more regularly. So for example, on the module side of things, you should be able to subscribe to the modules umbrella issue and receive all the pertinent modules updates. And so we're just trying to exercise that a bit better as well. Marcel, anything else from your side?
No, nothing else said. So send it over to Daniel.
Yep. So we've talked about Unity a bunch of times before, but just as a reminder, Unity is a CI step that is going to help ensure that the big changes coming to 0.6 and 0.7 don't break projects that use Q in a surprising way. Essentially, if you add your project to the corpus that gets tested with CI, if a change to Q would break your code in the way that it's being tested, then CI would notify us, right? So the way for you to add your project to the corpus is via the GitHub app that we've mentioned before, and now it's live on the GitHub Marketplace. You can install it. It works on both public and private projects. That was one of the major limitations of the previous system with Git submodules. And the corpus of the projects that we're testing with CI has grown from 6 to 11 since the last community call, so that's a nice doubling. We'll see if it keeps on doubling forever. And we'll also have a Q&A call next Wednesday at 2 p.m. UTC. that's basically for me to give a bit of a demo and more details, but also for people to ask detailed questions about how exactly it works, or maybe feature plans or any blockers that you might have from adding your project. We might not have time to do all of this today, so that's a full separate hour. And if you want to get in touch, you can do so via Slack, by email, and you can also book a session with me via that cal.com link. And I would suggest that if you want to add your project to Unity, you should contact me anyway, just because testing each project is different, so we need to coordinate a little bit.
Yeah. And I just want to reiterate how important this is. So we've got a tremendous number of issues with changes, like very early with through Unity. Compare that to if you make a change that breaks somebody and we find it out very late, it's often very hard to fix these changes retroactively later, right? So basically, we'll make sure that once your project is in, that we won't even check something in that will break your code, right? Like that's often how this will end up happening. So
Great, thank you, Daniel. Rog, do you want to talk about modules?
Sure. For those that don't know about it, the modules is the feature, like Go modules, if you're familiar with Go, where Q code will be able to import code to find published by other people, and you'll be able to publish your own modules yourself. Module having a collection of packages inside that. So basically, currently the code that lives inside the q.mod/pkg directory, you'll be able to publish that and import that yourself. So we had an updated version of the modules proposal, which is linked to there, and we had some great feedback on that, actually. Some really various others credited on the slide there, and others gave some great feedback, which we've been trying to take to heart and work towards updating the proposal with respect to that feedback. And one significant decision that we made, at least to propose, is that for the sort of backend, for actually storage backend, we think that using Open Container Initiative OCI registries is going to work out really well, and that should make it really easy for people to deploy their Clue modules as part of their containerized workloads in the cloud, amongst other. It actually gives us a load of flexibility and takes a bunch of implementation work off our hands as well, which is also great. So we've got some sub proposals there. So the storage model sub proposal, where we're proposing an actual specific format, like how these things should be stored as artifacts in a registry. And then there's a proposal for an app, which is initially, so this isn't the final thing, but certainly allows us to get towards where we're going, an app that will take a GitHub a tagged repository, tagged a commit inside the GitHub repository and upload it to the registry. And then there's a document that talks, a sub-proposal that talks about security, although with that GitHub app actually allows us to sidestep that to a degree, but we certainly want to talk about it. And as an ongoing thing, we want to have interactions and talk to anyone that is interested in modules. So we're planning to have some office hours, if you want to call it that, a meeting, an informal meeting every other Thursday, starting next week. So please come along and check out those discussions, and your feedback would be very much appreciated. They've only just been published.
Rog, just briefly, the sub-proposals, really, that initial V2 proposal was intentionally quite high level. The sub-proposals now sort of scratching the surface, getting into the details. So hence the reason why it's a good time now for folks to be engaging on the detail in those sub-proposals, I guess. Yeah,
that's exactly right. So there's a bunch more detail there that we've gone into, and that we would like people to talk about, to give us feedback on. Cedric has a question. Hi, Cedric.
Yeah. In terms of like the process for these kind of proposals, obviously it's a big feature. What is the timeline? Like, for example, how do you solidify, like, this is what we're going to implement and the proposal is now complete and we're going to move on to execution?
Maybe Paul's good to, or Marcel might be
Yeah,
good.
I mean, basically what we'll do is there will be an implementation alongside with the proposal that's experimental. So that's not the
Right.
final, that's only enabled through some feature flag, because basically modules is so incredibly complex. It's impossible to have a full proposal, sign off on all details, and then implement it. It's just not, not a good way to do it. I would think so. Yeah, and also by implementing, you often find, right, like certain limitations of a certain proposal. So one sub proposal that's not mentioned here, for example, is backwards compatibility. Like if you're using MVS, you need to have define what backwards compatibility means, which is very hard for Q. So we have like an initial sort of sketch how that would look like based on subsumption. But I'm sure that in practice this will not work, right? So there will be a lot of tweaking and sort of like figuring out what works in practice or not. So.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I was like, as a user, you kind of hear about these proposals and like, yeah, that's cool, but the actual whole life cycle from getting it from ideation to the completed thing, I think, is unclear usually for me. So that's
so we should have like something to experiment with, that reflects some form of the proposal, probably not its final form, but that should be fairly soon.
Just in the interest of, I think, let's try and keep a few more of the questions to the end if folks are happy with that. But Cedric, just briefly on your process point, even though we have these proposals sort of live and not yet accepted in parallel to, as Marcel said, an experimental implementation, and thanks to Tony, he pointed out we weren't clear on the fact that it would be experimental, and that's absolutely key, right? Is that every single decision, much like the Go proposal process, every decision we make as far as the proposal is concerned will be based on publicly available information. So everything that we're learning via these modules, office hours, this is just an opportunity for people to raise issues. And then we ostensibly make a decision based on the information that's before everybody at that point. So it's clear to everybody how the decision was reached. And it very much, as Marcel said, informed by the experimental implementation. So, but thank you to everybody who's provided feedback so far. Hopefully the opportunity to engage in a semi-regular basis, on a fortnightly basis on those calls, will help that feedback process as well. And so folks who are interested and have provided feedback, please do consider joining, because your feedback so far has been incredibly valuable. Okay, we've got a reminder of those dates of the upcoming calls at the end of the set of slides, but let's move on to WebAssembly and Aram.
Yeah, so we talked about WebAssembly before, but as a very quick reminder, WebAssembly is basically just a way to extend the computational aspects or ability of Q with user-provided or user-provided code, and especially with things of code that you might have already written for some purpose or another. Yeah, it's a technology based on a virtual machine. So we've been doing some work on WASM. And by the way, we're going to have like a deep session of our vision about WASM, what we think WASM should look like, both for our users, but both like in a broader context, like for the ecosystem and everything like that. So we're going to have a session about that next Tuesday. And we will also talk about the status of WASM in Q then. But as a shorter reminder for this week, next slide, please. Yeah, so we have merged initial support for WebAssembly. It's quite limited at the moment. Like the data types that you can pass to WebAssembly and back to Q are very limited, basically, because we're only using the CABI. So our main priority now is enriching the data model, allowing to pass more complex data types back and forth. But equally as important, making it ergonomic for the user, because now it's quite difficult to use. Again, we're going to talk about this in the longer session, but we envision like a nice user experience how this should be very simple to use and frustration free as possible. Yeah, that's about it, I think, on the WASM side.
Fantastic. The overview session, Aram, as well, obviously also going to talk about the connection between the WebAssembly piece of Q and the modules piece, and how that vision ties
Yes.
together.
Exactly, like because WebAssembly essentially it's a compiled format, so you have to compile something to WebAssembly, and we're thinking of using the modules that Roger previously talked about as basically a distribution mechanism for these modules.
Yeah. So for anybody interested in either of those, and obviously the modules sessions, feedback sessions coming up, please join those. The WebAssembly is just an initial deep dive session, but I think if we sort of find appetite from folks that actually we have more regular calls, either talking about the details of WebAssembly or whatever it might be, please just say, and we'll just organize those as there is sort of demand and need, as it were. Okay, thanks, Aram. Mine's the next update, talking about qlang.org, or now as I've titled this, alpha.qlang.org. As just a brief reminder, we are looking to update and replace ultimately qlang.org with a much improved documentation site that considers a better way of explaining to people what Q is and handling the various different use cases that Q seeks to cover. That's being worked on at alpha.qlang.org right now. So we're working on it out in the open from the content side and from the front end side. And from the front end side of things as well. So the look and feel, UI, UX. There's a new language guide that is available it's a work in progress as part of alpha.qlang.org under /docs. It's clearly linked from there. Please, if you want to, have a start looking through this right now and raising issues against the content that you see in there as well. Those parts that we have published are, let me just say, 80% done insofar as what is up there. So really, it would be great to get feedback on whether people, for example, think we should explain things in a totally different way, or whether they don't like the voice or tone in which some of the documentation is created. We're looking for feedback on all of these things. Plus, whether actually the site works from your perspective. Does the layout work? What would you like to see more or less of? Key part of this, as I was talking to Rudy just before the call started, is that we want to ensure we don't have a situation of documentation rot. With a very wide base of how Q can be used, lots of different use cases, documentation needs to cover lots of different use cases. And so it's quite a job keeping on top of documentation. And so in order to try and deal with the documentation rot side of things, we've been in parallel to designing the new site, actually coming up with a new pipeline that helps us automate how our documentation will not rot, or at least that's the plan. So just moving on to what the next steps are, that's the road to beta. As I was saying to Rudy, really we should have made good progress by the next community call, perhaps tentatively suggesting we might be able to flip the current qlang.org to beta.qlang.org, i.e. perform the switch in about a couple of community calls time. So that needs us to ramp up the content creation between now and then, as well as ensuring all the automations in place, and restarting the docs and content calls a key part of that. So that's what I'll be doing between now and the next community call on all fronts there. Moving now to, I'm happy to take calls at the end, and that first docs and content call could even be a bit of a deep dive in the process of how actually we're doing, how that pipeline for alpha.qlang.org works as well. Moving to community updates, Carmen, can I hand over to you?
Sure. The first one is a call for proposals for the SplashConf, which is the ACM SIG Plan's annual conference. It will be held 27 October in Portugal this year. And we wanted to ask, there is a co-located event, and we wanted to ask practitioners to submit to Confling. So Confling is a workshop that's co-located, and it focuses on the design, usage, and tooling of configuration programming languages. And the idea is to take industry practitioners, which would be you all, to meet with the language designers and passionate hobbyists. So the deadline for that is going to be 12th June. And if you have an interest in submitting something, but maybe want to wordsmith that or workshop that or have a soundboard for that, please contact us in community Slack or at documentation@q.works. So that we welcome anybody who has an idea, but maybe needs a little bit more of a soundboard to get that off the ground and to make that a CFP. Similarly, we'd also want people to continue to use our project spaces to show and tell some of the things that they are building with Q, because that then becomes a nice virtuous cycle of sharing and having other people get ideas for either use cases that apply to them as well as documentation for us. And lastly, you can use the, if you are interested or using Q for another tool and technology and you want to experiment with us or look for guidance with us or fellow community members, we encourage you to use the GitHub discussion space in the Q repo on GitHub and use the Q&A category. Or if you want to, again, wordsmith that first, use the Q community Slack. Or if it's a private affair that you just don't want to put in a public forum, use the email at documentation@q.works. And
Carmen,
with that,
just to briefly check, Carmen, you mentioned a deadline for the call for papers of the 12th of June.
that's
Did you
right.
mean
Sorry,
12th
July. Thank you
12th
for
of
that.
July.
I'm
Okay.
mixing up my J months. But yes, July 12th, 2023. And I will pass that back on to you, Paul, for experimentation on that note.
Yeah, exactly. Just building on that last point of experimenting. Jonathan Matthews, as some folks might know, is a member of the Q community and is working out how Q and Terraform can actually play nicely together. And experiment that we've run in conjunction with Jonathan, who's unfortunately not on the call today, otherwise he would be doing this update, is to try and combine Q and Terraform together in a useful way. And so we are actually using Q and Terraform to drive our GitHub organization and repository configuration in a declarative way. So HashiCorp's Terraform is traditionally configured using HCL, but it does also understand JSON. And as folks who are familiar with Q will know, Q understands JSON. So there seemed like an obvious experiment to try out here to see how it actually worked out. So if you'll excuse, well, it's not really a pun, it's just sort of a bit of a play there. So the iconography being Q plus Terraform to drive, hence the car, GitHub configuration. Don't all laugh at once. So we're planning to have a bit of a walkthrough of this experiment. Jonathan and I will be on the call, we'll be giving a demo, and we'll also be sharing publicly a repository in which all of this code is available. It's a pretty decent first cut. By no means it's sort of necessarily a production ready system, although we are using it in production. So that's the 28th of June, 3:30 UTC. Jonathan and I will start with like a 15-20 minutes demonstration of how the system works at the moment, and then just totally open it up to folks who might have questions about Q and Terraform in some way, shape, or form. So Carmen, I think back to you actually here.
Yeah, to recap, you've heard all of us give some project updates, and we are trying something new, which is we can't seem to get enough feedback and fit everything in the calls from month to month. And sometimes because we're working so much, we don't update as much as we'd like to or interact with as much as we'd like to. So for the next couple weeks, we are having these additional calls and deep dives, and they were all mentioned, but we are aggregating them here in this calendar. Next week will be a busy week. We'll start off on Tuesday. Ram will do a deep dive with the WebAssembly and Q session. Then Daniel will have a Q&A session for the Unity CI and helping anybody who's interested in registering their repo or onboarding to Q with their Q code. Followed by what Paul just said, the Q and Terraform live walkthrough. And then finally, every other Thursday, starting the 29th of June, Roger will be facilitating proposal feedback sessions, office hours, that sort of thing, where the new module sub-proposals or proposal addendums that were just published can be discussed and feedback will happen. So we're experimenting with this, and we look forward to getting feedback from you both and attending some of these, as well as feedback onto whether these times are working for you and whether the length or the frequency will work for you as we try this experiment out. The next ones that we also said and discussed will be to be scheduled. One is, as Paul said, the docs and content calls that will be picked back up. But another, as we anticipate 0.6 coming out by the next community call, we wanted to have a required field session and have Marcel host that and talk through the mental models and also some of the usages and demos, so that this very important and highly requested feature will have a session all its own. So we look forward to getting those on the calendar as we issue Garden and Milestone and get closer to the next release.
Great, thanks, Carmen. Just a reminder, we are trying in parallel to sort of scheduling relevant calls, also increase our activity on Twitter. That's an ongoing project with the number of projects or project areas we're working on. It's a hard thing to manage at the same time, but trust us, we're trying. So we will get better at communicating updates via Twitter, and also just making sure that works well together with the updates we're posting on GitHub as well. So if you would like to tweet us on Q_Lang, please do. Another means really of sharing what it is folks are working on. We haven't set a date yet for the next community call, but just to re-emphasize, we aim to have these every month. That feels like a good cadence unless folks disagree. It just allows us to effectively roll up the updates that have happened, for example, on modules between one call and the next, in a form where we can then move to Q&A, which we'll move to in just a second. Feedback, if folks, yes, just to repeat, if anybody sees something they don't like the look of or would like to see more of, or would like us to start doing, please just let us know. We're very open to feedback. Whether you want to contact us publicly or privately, please be in touch. So with that, 2 minutes overdue in terms of the Q&A starting, which isn't too bad. We open it up to Q&A. Cedric, thank you for any more modules questions, please, and anything else, folks, please jump in at this point.
I had some observations. You know, I've been working on a project called Saddle. I don't know how much rest of the community knows about it, but it's kind of early stages, so I didn't want to talk too much about it. I want to give some observations of actually using Q, especially as a Go API. While doing that, maybe I have some questions around that too. But one thing I noticed is it's unclear to me how much I should be like using Q, like the Q.value, and kind of treating that as something I query, and then when do I translate that into the actual Go structs to do, you know, whatever business logic my application is doing. Should I be treating it as kind of like an in-memory database? You know, I'm assuming that there's going to be more facilities, especially with like the query language and things like that, to actually manipulate and walk that tree of, or the graph of values. I'm trying to figure out that balance, and that's something that's not clear to me right now. As well as things like in the module system, it seems like, you know, there's inspiration from Go, and we're using the OCI stuff for packaging. Does it make sense though with in terms of a configuration language? I'm assuming the data is kind of statically defined. It can be passed around more easily because it's not in the context of compiling into a binary. Like it might stand alone for analysis or something, or for distribution if you want to like host some data and then query it from other machines. Do we want to optimize for that kind of use case in the modules? Things like that, I guess, is like the differentiation of a configuration language and how that affects the design of these kind of core components.
So just to summarize, there are 2 questions around the usage of the Go API, and best practices there. And secondly, the boundary, if I can summarize it, is that between what is distributed as a module versus perhaps what is, I don't want to necessarily say more dynamic data, but modules data.
Yeah, and I brought that up in the proposal for the modules. I had some ideas around it, but I'm not sure like what the right balance is, so I didn't want to make a firm statement there. But it seems like I'm kind of concerned if we walk in a certain path and then become path dependent versus something that would have much more useful use case for a configuration language kind of thing, and how we're thinking about that.
Roger, you had your hand up first. If you want, I don't know, what was that an addition to Cedric's question or?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to mention, like when you're talking about Q.value, actually, there's a feature that's upcoming, which is actually kind of a lack, currently a lack of a feature, but something that actually will I think, be quite interesting in the Q.value space, in that currently if you unmarshal into a Go value or you decode into a Go value, then it has to be essentially fully concrete. Whereas if you marshal from if you encode from a Go value, you can actually have a Q value inside your Go struct, and that's actually really, really versatile. So the feature, and I think it's pretty simple to implement, although I haven't quite got around to, is that if you decode into a Go struct, you'll be able to have a Q value in there too, which means that you can kind of leave some bits of your Go struct, like have incomplete values and that kind of thing inside your Go struct while unmarshalling or decoding stuff into Go, other bits, concrete bits into Go, while leaving other bits less interpreted. So I think that kind of impacts on on the usefulness of being able to, and I think in general it's all about use case, right? Whether you work on something inside a Go struct or a Go value, or if you do it in QValue and use it that way, there are always going to be trade-offs involved.
Fair to say, Cedric, if you as you're working through this, I would hope or ask politely for you to gather these notes in such a way that you can then just blurt that feedback out somewhere and say, look, I found this easy, this hard. And in terms of these patterns that you and Roger are alluding to, I think that's a key point that doesn't necessarily have a concrete, I was going to use the word concrete, a perfect answer right now. And as people experiment on these things, I think the sharing of these sorts of questions and answers actually helps us to get to the best answer, whereas Roger was suggesting the best answer could actually be quite context specific. And so just trying to work out ways of communicating what the different options are. And Marcel, you can come in perhaps on the data point that Cedric was talking about earlier.
Yeah, exactly. So the second part of the question. So my connection like goes in and out.
You're very clear so far.
Okay, great. Yeah, so actually Aram is looking also in an ability for if you have gaps in queue, that you can, for example, map that on a database and get data in dynamically, right? So like a Q to SQL translator, we're looking into that. But generally, the idea is that if you look at any kind of data that you might have, whether it's like static configuration or configuration GitHub, or any kind of dynamic data that you might have, like an etcd, whatever, right? Like this, you could imagine that all of this data is mapped into a namespace, like a Q namespace, whether that be with a module interface or a single large namespace, right? So we've definitely had ideas like how you would model that in Q, right? Like how do you model the fact that you don't have a single big configuration, but you have some parts of your configuration that are more dynamic, and there's some feedback in between that. Like how would you even model that? Like if you think of home automation, for example, right? Like certain things are outside actors which might influence configuration, but there's constraints on that. So what's a model for within Q that can encompass that? So I don't think this is necessarily through the modules approach, right? Modules approach is really something shareable things that you can get. But it is within the Q namespace mode, right? So maybe at the package level, I could imagine it, for example, which is close to modules, right? But it's different.
And if I can cut in a little bit, I think the original thing I was thinking about a few years ago, I talked about like the infrastructure graph. A lot of my interest in Q was based on that original problem, like how do you manage this really big config? And it seems like these problems are pretty related. Like you have existing over in different machines, some big thing, how does it combine together? What's the workflow to work with that directly? If it's pure data, how do you move it around or like pull that data in so that you can use it for that specific subgraph and work with it?
There's different models for that. So if you look at for example admission control, like OSO HQ or others, like they have run into similar problems. If you look at any kind of admission control, you run into this problem where there's a mix of static and dynamic data. And how do you model that, right? Like if you look at Q in general, the problem that it can solve is like this whole shift left business, right? Where you want to identify problems as early as possible. So there is at least some chunk of your data that you want to be able to move and be available earlier in evaluation, right? So I mean, this is very early stage for Q, but we're thinking about that kind of stuff. Like how would you do that? Aram? Yeah.
Just to add a little bit about what you said about modeling like external data or other sort of data into a Q namespace. You used the word imagine, and I think that was a very cogent word. It's exactly, yeah. So what we don't want to do, we don't want to convert things to Q. We just want for things to have like a Q a model that's representable in Q, but without actually doing the translation. So in a way, we would always work on the true dynamic data, like a reference to the real data, as opposed to like a conversion to Q. Like the fact that there's no intermediate layer is important, and we want to leverage. I mean, we used the SQL example earlier, but SQL itself has like powerful querying capabilities and things that happen inside the SQL database. And we wish to leverage as much of that as possible. We don't want to just, even if you compute or do Q operations on the data that's backed by a SQL database, we don't want to just copy the data into Q and do something with it. We want to leverage as much as what the thing itself offers, but still have like full Q level power and abstraction and the way we think about things inside Q.
Got it. Yeah.
Thanks. Great questions, Cedric. Just to summarize answers there, please do gather feedback for anyone who's experimenting or trying to do something with Q. If you are finding rough edges, it's great to have things like experience reports that we can, as a community, then reflect on and say, how should we actually be addressing these? On the point about data and dynamic data, perhaps more specifically, it is early days in these experiments that we're doing with Q and SQL, but to sort of use this as an opportunity to say to folks, look, if you are interested in this space and say, hey, I've got a use case here, there's 2 or 3 that have been presented to us so far, please let us know so we can work out where it sort of fits into the picture, if nothing else, in these early days. And it might be that in subsequent community calls or a subsequent deep dive session, we actually talk about this in more detail. But for now, it's just exploration at this stage. Anybody else got any other questions they want to raise? Mario.
Yeah, hi. So
welcome.
I am currently, since a few weeks, experimenting with QLang. I have a platform, Kubernetes monorepo, tens of clusters and a few workloads, and I'm trying to replace all of this with Q or most of this. So all of this is private, and I'm not even sure if it can be open source, but I'm really interested in Unity. And now the question is, I've seen there's a GitHub app. What happens with my config? Does it stay private and your validator does only run inside my repo and report some feedback, or how does this work?
Daniel, did you want to jump in on that point there?
It actually cut off for me slightly. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. So I'll repeat the question out loud, and then Daniel, you can complement my answer here. So when you register with Unity, what it does is it registers a specific repo, or repos plural. And right now that copies the contents, all of those contents, to a private copy. That is private to us. So that's not shared with anybody at all. Even the results aren't shared at all as to the result of running a test against the configuration. So we have a number of private code bases already added to Unity, precisely because people were worried about the privacy aspect of it. This is why, as Daniel suggested, we added this GitHub app so that it is capable of handling private code bases as well. But even the public code bases aren't, for now, surfaced anywhere at all. It's all kept private in terms of the testing that we do on the project side of things. So if we ever do start to surface things, it would only ever be reflecting the visibility, as it were, that we see, i.e. a private app would only ever be private to those people who can see it. Public, I suspect it would be looking to relax that, to share it either totally publicly or to those people who have control of the project. Daniel, please, hopefully I've summarized the question well enough, and Daniel, hopefully I've half answered that.
Yeah, I think that was a pretty nice answer. Thank you, but this opens more questions now.
Well, we have the session, the Q&A session around Unity, or otherwise, if it is a private project and you have slightly more discrete questions to ask of Daniel, please feel free to set up time with him. That's exactly why when we share the slides, there'll be the link to Daniel's calendar to just book time in, go through the details. And would be great to get more projects added, because as Marcel said, oh, there we go. Thank you, Daniel. That'd be great. Thank you. Steve.
Hi. The issue count continues to increase. Frighteningly, it's at about 609 right now, many of which I assume are just enhancement requests. One thing I'm curious about is for the team that's actually implementing things, do you work toward bug reports that you see? Do the bug reports just kind of get closed incidentally as a side effect of work that you did anyway? You know, and then you notice that it looks like you fixed something that you weren't setting out to fix. How's that going?
It's a combination of things, right? Like if there's very seemingly urgent issues or easy to fix issues, we might jump on it proactively. But like with the issue gardening specifically that we're working on, it's really about prioritization, going through all of this. It's also a matter of clustering. So if we see, just to make our use of time more efficient, right? So if we see there's a whole bunch of issues regarding to trim, related to trim, instead of like, you know, doing them one by one and sort of loading that context, right? Sometimes it's better to just do them all at once, right? So to batch them up, doing them all at once. So that's a different strategy. Sometimes it's like, okay, yeah, we see this as a big issue, but we know this will be fixed in 0.7. So there's, you know, like, okay, this depends on like how bad is it to do it now. By the way, we also merged some repos. I believe, Paul, you know more of that. So there's actually more different kind of issues coming in there as well, which is increasing the count, but not necessarily the count for the Q core project, if you will. So that's another reason why the count's been going up.
I see Daniel's hand up. I'll just answer that point that Marcel raised. Steve, we have consolidated our issue trackers down to 1, just from ease of management. So I think not to say that the issue count isn't going up. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. But there are a number of qlang.org issues in there as well. So the total issue count is that, plus feedback on proposals or issues that people raise around proposals, plus things around tooling. So there's a number of things that now get rolled up. And so this is where we need to be better at labeling things to ensure that for example, all the qlang.org things are labeled as qlang.org so that we can work out which is in which bucket. The idea behind labeling things and gardening is also that we just get a better handle on exactly the problem you're talking about, as well as, are we getting through stuff? And fundamentally, that's what matters. What matters is getting releases out, releases that deliver new features in balance with dealing with performance issues, for example, or correctness issues. So there's a timing aspect to it. And the thing is, as I said, if we don't get the milestones right, that's where people should just be flagging, look, this is a higher priority issue for us because it is blocking X, Y, and Z. I think back particularly to last October when, with the QValue project, we just did a very big focus on a number of issues that they'd had to help them move forward. We're very willing to do the same thing again. If actually there's a large body of work that is like, hang on a second, this is blocking X, Y, and Z, very happy to consider that. So please share with us. Daniel, you've patiently had your hand up.
I think it's also worth clarifying that there's multiple kinds of issues and multiple stages that we handle them in. So some issues come in, and after initial triage, you realize that it's actually more like a question, or maybe it's a duplicate, or maybe they ran face first into like a bit of an edge case, a sharp corner, and it's working as intended, but it's confusing. So then it's not really a bug; it's more like a feature request, you could say. So I think part of the effort that we're doing with issue gardening, the reason we're going back to essentially the first issue that's still open, is that we're looking back to all the issues that remain open to see if they're still valid, because like you say, some of them we actually did fix without remembering that it was already filed before. Some others might be now somewhat duplicates with some newer proposals that have been filed. Some others maybe weren't using the bug template that we use now because it's evolved over time. So I think this work, even though it's not closing issues, it's making them more closable, if that makes sense. Because some issues, unless you've actually digested them a little bit, you don't even know if there is anything to fix, right?
Yeah, got it. It's just something, I don't know if you've ever considered it, because I'm not even sure it really works, but some prior art I noticed on the Terraform providers, some of those repositories, is they use thumbing for people to vote. And supposedly, it's hard to verify whether this is really happening, that the maintainers will watch for which ones are accumulating the most, as a sense to get, this would be a high impact one to fix first because many people are running into it. So even though maybe we get multiple reports that we fold as duplicates, there could be a lot of also drive-by, recognize the issues, see it's there, but there really isn't anything you can do about it to raise its importance or make it clear that it's impacting more people.
That's a very good point. In that respect, the prior art is also the Go issue tracker, to the extent that emojis are some indicator of how excited people are about something. I don't know that I would ever necessarily be excited about a bug. I think that was Daniel's point that he just linked to. People get excited about new features. And so perhaps there's a sort of a bias towards people getting excited for the new shiny things, where actually the fixing of the old bugs. But your point is very well received. I think the thing we're trying to do is just encourage folks, whether it be publicly or privately, to just share with us. If this is a big issue, let us know, and just sort of bear in mind that, to your point, there are a number of issues, and sometimes it might actually need shouting a bit loud or shouting on a number of occasions until we actually get the balance on these things right. And I think if we just remain open to the fact that we're not going to get a perfect balance, then we can sort of all hopefully work together to ensure we try to reach that best balance as best as possible. But thank you for bringing it up again.
Yeah, I think also just one last thought there. There are some of them where I think I'm sufficiently motivated. I'd love to fix it myself, but I do keep an eye on the Garrett changes. And most frequently when I see things that get merged that fix a problem, Marcel, it's usually you, and I read them, and I'll admit my conclusion is usually, I don't think I would have ever come up with that. Like, I wouldn't have known where to look. So I still don't feel like I know my way around the code well enough to fix some of the things that are probably lower hanging fruit.
Yeah, so some of the evaluator rewrite makes the evaluator also more comprehensible, although the evaluator is probably not a good part to start with fixes. It's a very complex piece of code. Also very specific, right? Like graph unification. But there's other parts of the code where that should be much more straightforward. But yeah,
Steve, I think you're being very humble there. What I'd suggest is, we've sort of talked about this before, and Daniel and I know talked about it, is perhaps having sessions where just open office hours as well, where we perhaps take a couple of open issues and talk about what solutions in that space might look like. Daniel just made the point very well in the discussion, is quite often I will make mistakes in terms of guessing what the right solution might be as well. But I think that's part of the learning process. And I think we'd be sort of keen to help extend that learning process with others, and that I will very often have totally the wrong handle on things. But collectively, learning together, we're very happy to share with others the mistakes that we make in working out what the solutions might be. So if something like that office hours would be of interest to you, Steve, or indeed others, I think we'd be very willing to give that a shot, because for example, there's even parts of the QLang.org work with the preprocessor over there. It's a very different beast altogether, but it's all contributions towards ultimately what the Q project is able to do. So yes, whatever ways that we can, and Jack and others have said that once we make actual progress on the LSP side of things, that they'd be willing to contribute there. So I think there's a number of different ways that folks can contribute, and to what extent we can help with that process, please let us know.
Yeah, I think that would be office hours like that would be great. I recognize too, if you were receiving more unsolicited contributions, though, it's a distraction for you to review them. Where it could be that on net it's not actually helping you, other than just broadening the base of people who kind of know what to do there.
I think it's a very interesting point. There's a sort of chicken and egg issue there, though, right? Is that if we didn't start somewhere, we'd not make progress anywhere. The approach we generally tend to follow there is ensuring that there's an issue for something. And what that does is it allows the bug, first of all, let's assume it's a bug, to be fully understood in the issue before we start to make progress anywhere. Then allows somebody to assign themselves to it, so it's very clear that somebody is working on it. And if there are any sort of design-related questions, just to try and tackle those up front, and to do so in the issue in such ways that bubble everything to the surface as much as possible, or at least raise the unknown questions as we go. But you raise a valid point. There's no right answer there, but we're keen to try and engage where we can on that.
Great, thanks.
Okay, we're coming close to time, actually. Maybe time for one last question. Otherwise, and whilst anybody is raising their hand, I'll just summarize that we'll be sending out a date for the next call as soon as we have that penciled in, and it'll be added to the shared calendar as well. Perhaps I will just go back to this slide here, which gives us the dates for the upcoming sessions. We will be sharing the slides so folks can actually add these after the fact as well, and publishing the YouTube recording as well. I'm keen to finish now because it's actually 4:30 UK time, which means we will finish on time. So without wishing to cut anybody off, thank you everybody for joining. Please ask away in the discussion that we had around today's community call if there's anything we have missed that you'd like to follow up on. Otherwise, we look forward to chatting next time. Thanks, everybody.